Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley, managing partner at Oxbow, and I have the real pleasure today of interviewing again Neil Howe. And I will tell you personally, Neil is the greatest demographer, geographer. This guy knows as much about the world as anybody I've ever talked to or read about. I take his service. And Neil has been around a long time. His original book was, The Fourth Turning, but his new book, which is coming out today, is The Fourth Turning is Here. And I would recommend, I've read this book twice. I would recommend you to get this book. You will find it incredibly interesting about what Neil thinks is going to be happening through this fourth turning we're in. But Neil, I know you're one of the managing directors at Hedgeye, and your stuff goes out all over the country and all over the world. But thank you for being with us.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be back.
And so, Neil, you might just briefly, for people that a lot of people know this, but briefly describe the turning. So when we get into the fourth turning is here, they'll know a little bit about what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, this was something that I worked on for years with my co-author, Bill Strauss. And it was a book called Generations that came out in 1991. The fourth turning came out in 1997. And it really hypothesized or put forward a view that modern history moves in generationally driven cycles, and that these move kind of through a seasonal set of four eras, and we call them first turning, second turning, third turning, fourth turning, kind of the spring, the summer, the fall, the winter season. And we were inspired to do that by actually looking very closely at generational biographies throughout history, and we noticed how they tended to repeat. We also noticed that there was a very interesting long-term periodicity in American history. We have these enormous civic crises about every lifetime, right? We go from, people are very familiar with the fact that we had the American Revolution. About a lifetime later, about 80 to 90 years later, we had the Civil War. 80 to 90 years later, we had the Great Depression or World War II, and here we are today, right? And roughly halfway in between, we have these great awakening periods, these great cultural upheavals, and there's a very interesting tension between these two. Certain generations come of age during the cultural upheavals; other generations come of age during the outer world crisis. And that's kind of the overall picture, right, of what we're talking about. And
you mentioned, if you look at it, about people don't realize this, but the span of their lifetime, if they knew their grandparents and knew their parents and they know their children and knew their grandchildren, I think that's something like 230 years that you touch.
It's a long time. It's about it. If you look at the oldest person who knew you as a child, and think of that person's lifetime, right? All the things that they experienced. Now think of the youngest person who will know you in old age, and think how long they will live. So I call that our sort of personal history span, right? I mean, the personal interactions you're going to have in your lifetime. True for me, Ted. I'm sure it's true for you. This will probably be around 230 years or so. That's about as long as the United States has been around. It's a long time. And it really forces us to think about these longer term periods. I will say one thing that's very interesting about turnings, since they last about a long human lifetime, and that is every turning we're entering, every new social mood that we're entering as a nation unfolds just as the last people who recall the last time we were in it are passing away.
Interesting.
That's very interesting, right? The period we are entering is exactly the period that the people who are now passing away recall.
Yeah.
There's an interesting lesson in that as well about, remembering history and history repeating.
Well, I think what you've done, and trying to move into the book, and I have to say, everybody needs to get this book. It's a great read. But if you move into it now, you might do the setup. In the book, I love the way you do a setup to say, okay, this is how this got set up. This is where we are, and these are sort of two of the outcomes that could happen, good and bad. But that'd be great if you could walk people through that.
Well, I start the book, I think, in chapter 1, where we are,
Mm-hmm.
Post GFC, post pandemic America, an era when people feel that large scale institutional life is turning dysfunctional. No one feels like anyone's in charge of this country anymore. And we feel that the two parties are essentially leaderless. And we are gripped in a epic, polarized partisan contest in America that holds real danger for the country, as well as by mounting international chaos and geopolitical threats. Well, gee, where have we seen this before? Yeah, that's the immediate thing. Where have we seen this before? Well, let's go back to the 1930s, and then before that, let's maybe go back to, the late 1850s, moving into the Civil War. And you get the point here, right?
Yeah.
And these are or even the late 1760s and earlier. I mean, we go through 6 or 7 centuries. We basically
Right.
go back to the dawn of modernity at the end of the Renaissance, and we take this through all of Anglo-American history. So this is a pattern that is repeated many times, and not just in America, but increasingly, this is happening around the world. When we look at the rise of authoritarian populism, this is not only, or I should say even primarily, an American phenomenon. We see it in Southern Europe. We see it in Southern and East Asia. We see it in Latin America. We see it everywhere. And it's being driven by the same basic generational drivers. So now a lot of the things feed into this Ted, that I talk about in the book. I mean, I talk about privilege and inequality. I talk about the lack of authority and the lack of community, and how all of this goes into the maelstrom. And I think it's one chapter. There's so many different places I could expatiate here, Ted. In one chapter, I think, where I talk about the millennial crisis, we actually look at scenarios, right, where this country could go. And then I think in another one, I talk about social transformations, and that is basic social trends that we can expect by the time we exit this fourth turning, sometime in the very end of the 2020s. Probably, though, it will be in the early 2030s.
Now, let me ask you, today we just find generally, forget politics, forget anything else, we just find that generally people in general are really just totally undone about what's going on in their countries and their communities. There doesn't seem to be any consistency. And I was going to ask you this question. That would have been the same, say, pre-Civil War or going back to Rome or wherever this stuff happened. Right. But it seems to be people today are so, I would use the term unsettled right now.
Right. And I think, I address that. And I think one reason why people are so despondent, we talk about things like midlife deaths of despair in America. We've actually seen declining life expectancy for the last 10 years now, since 2014. We see some terrible, a terrible sense of loss of hope, I think. And I think that the lesson is that hardship isn't it isn't a problem for most people. I think human beings are programmed for hardship. We really are. We're genetically prepared for hardship. That isn't really a problem. It's hardship without purpose. that's what we can't stand. Hardship without connection, without meaning, without any sense of where it's going. And this is, I think, one of the reasons I wrote the book, to let people know that we've been here before, we've been here again. People today are not just disconnected geographically, right? We feel disconnected from any sense of nationhood or broader national community or broader community sense of where we're going. But we're also connected in time from our parents and our kids. And partly, you recall, Ted, I talk about this in the book, this very modern ideology of linear time, right? Everything is always changing to some destination. And therefore, since nothing ever repeats, we're always just moving ahead historically. And people like to talk about progress. We're living better, everything's getting nicer or whatever, right? What that means is that you have no connection to your parents, and you will have no connection with your kids. What can you pass on to them? What wisdom, what knowledge you have will be relevant for them, because they'll just say, well, it's a different world for me. Look at all these new technological gizmos, right? What do you have to teach me? And this is a feeling of great, gives rise to a great deal of sort of pessimism and despair among people, and is one of the reasons why I think people are so fundamentally upset. Again, it's not the hardship, it's the sense that they don't know where anything is headed, and there is no pattern, there is no rhyme or reason.
And that's a number one thing that we sense from people. I mean, if you people are all so frustrated, politics breaks up families, everybody's, extreme here, extreme there, and then people will say, gosh, this country looks nothing like it did, at a certain time or other times. Even people that are 40 years old say, gosh, it's not like it was when I was in high school. I mean, there's a lot of that out there right now. And I think people generally that I talk to, including investors, are like, I'm not certain I recognize this country as much as I used to. Maybe that's part of the fourth turning.
Oh, it definitely is. And there's a little story I talk about in the book. I don't know if you recall this, Ted, but it's Rip Van Winkle.
Yes, sleeping, coming back. Yeah,
it's an old short story.
Yeah.
and a lot of us read it, when we were in school. I don't know if they still teach it anymore. Probably it's off the curriculum for some reason. But it was a wonderful old story, right? By oh gosh, who was it? It was a diplomat. He was in Britain, Washington Irving. Yes.
Right.
And it was a little short story, and it was fascinating because we all remember it. It's about this this guy who was in a very difficult marriage. Let's just put it that way, right? He was sort of he was constantly browbeaten by his wife, and he goes up into the Catskill Mountains and near the Hudson, and he meets some dwarfs, and he takes some of their drink, and he falls asleep for 20 years. Now, one thing you know at early on that he lives at the time in the late 1760s, okay? And he wakes up 20 years later and he goes back into his village. And the comment he makes is, I can't recognize anything anymore. Where's King George? It's all been torn down, and there's this guy called George Washington. Everyone's talking about the rights of man and Senate and Congress. You got to vote Republican or Federalist, and he has no idea what's going on, and he feels like he's losing his mind. And there's a lot of interesting commentary about how this was a sort of a metaphorical description of how America felt going through those 20 years of crisis, right? When everything about their fundamental institutional landscape changed, and what it felt like to go through it, right? Now, for anyone who hasn't read the story, this story ends very well. It turns out his wife died while he was sleeping. So that problem took care of itself. But it's a great story, and I talk about how repeatedly in these periods of crisis, you ask this question, do you recognize your country anymore? And people say no. And by the way, that question has been asked repeatedly over the past 3 or 4 years by opinion survey companies. And a very large and rising share of Americans say, I don't recognize my, it's exactly the question you were asking, right? We all feel a little bit like Rip Van Winkle's, waking up.
So, with that, if you could take us through from here forward, we know how everything now is just really up in the air, but from here forward, because you make such good points in this book about the generational aspects of what those generations are going to look like, and that's so interesting.
Well, typically in a fourth turning, you have a different kinds of generations at each phase of life. You have what we call a prophet archetype, which is moving into old age, right? That's boomers. And boomers are very focused on vision and values. They tend to be very uncompromising in, the absolutes that they're pursuing. They tend to be very individualist in how they look at life. They came of age during the awakening, right? When the entire society was individuating, different strokes for different folks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we thought that was a great thing. One thing that boomers absolutely hated coming of age was the middle class, right? Another Pleasant Valley Sunday. That was the ultimate nightmare.
I remember that song.
And yeah, you remember that song?
Oh, yeah.
Remember everybody, charcoal burning everywhere. And this very huge middle class. Well, in fact, America at that time had one of the greatest degrees of income inequality in the past 2 centuries. And the Gini coefficient of income and wealth was approaching its low point in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And boomers hated it, right? And we did everything we could to spring people free from all these institutional and social constraints. Well, God knows what happened, right? We succeeded. Boomers succeeded. 1984 was not going to be 1984, as the famous Apple ad declared. And in fact, we became a much more individualistic society. The rich became richer, the poor became poorer. We all became rich, more spread out. And in many ways, the society we have now is sort of the boomer vision finally come to life, although perhaps not in quite the mood that they thought it would be. You know what I mean? And this is a lesson, by the way, to all generations, not just boomers, but what they want coming of age. It's the old saying, right? Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Because what you finally get actually happens, but it's not exactly what you wanted, right? So what happened is we have a society like that, and boomers are simultaneously very indulgent of all of this inequality and all this diversity. On the other hand, they have this underlying moral absolutism, which is forever dissatisfied with what they brought about. Okay, then you have Gen Xers who are born up as, throwaway kids, brought up from birth really to be free agents and all this individualism. They didn't have to throw off the institutions like boomers did. They're just, the institutions are never there, right? And so they are survivors. We call them a nomad architect. And they are gritty, cynical, practical, and they know how to get things done.
And Neil, for the audience, that age group I generally know, but you might tell that age group for the Xers.
Well, they're born 1961 to 1981. So right now they're basically in their, from the early 40s to the early 60s right now, right? Yeah. And that's who they are. They're all over the map in terms of income and wealth. They are generally falling behind their parents at a very bad time of life. Slightly more than half of this generation is not doing as well as their parents. Significantly more than half of the men are not doing as well as their fathers. And they're very pessimistic about the future. And they're very pragmatic, and very limited in what they hope for their future. If you ask Gen Xers, for instance, half of them would say, I'd be perfectly happy to completely scrap Social Security because I don't think I'm going to get benefits anyway. If you just give me some little lump sum, I'll just patch it right now and run with it. So this is a generation that doesn't expect much. They've always been told that they weren't going to go anywhere. So of course they thrive in the individualism to try to get around that. Then you have the millennials, right? Who come of age, who coming up still to some extent coming of age now. They were born, the first wave millennials were born in the early 1980s. And these were suddenly much more protected kids, right? They had the baby on board, bumper stickers, and they had the special car seats, and they had the cuddly baby movies when they're growing up, and suddenly the whole world loved kids. And so these are the hallmark traits of millennials, that they're wanted, they're special. Everyone knows that millennials from the very beginning were special in a way that Xers never were. And you go down the list, and I've written many books on millennials for colleges and the military and so on. But Xers are a very different kind of generation from both boomers, millennials are a very different kind of generation from both boomers and Xers. For one thing, millennials are fine with convention. They get along well with their parents. In fact, many of them are living with their parents. A record share of them are living with their parents because they're special. Why not?
Yeah.
And there's no problem with it. They tend to be very community oriented. They tend to be very peer oriented. And the biggest problem with loneliness today is among millennials. FOMO, fear of missing out.
Neil, I saw a graph on that, and you can tell me if this is correct, that 25% of 40-year-olds, which would be millennials, are single. They haven't been married. Is that right?
Yeah, that's probably right. Now, a larger share than before are having kids without getting married. But nonetheless, We've also seen with this generation an epic decline in the fertility rate, right? And Americans are not having as many kids. And a lot of this is due to not because millennials don't want kids. And I as a demographer, I come back to this again and again. The desired number of kids for people as you move, from birth cohorts, from people born in the early 60s, early 70s, early 80s, and so on, hasn't really gone down very much at all. But the actual number is going down. Because people tell me, well, they're not having kids because they think it's bad for the planet and all this stuff. Actually, the data really don't back that up. They're not having kids because, first of all, they don't feel they can afford them economically, and also because the social institutions kind of surrounding courtship and work life and marriage and everything aren't amenable to finding a suitable partner. I mean, if you ask millennial women, they'll say, I can't find anyone. And that's why I'm going to college and getting degrees more than men, because I can't count on anybody, in this environment. Mm-hmm. So that sense, again, of institutional dysfunction is there. So you have millennials, but millennials are also very confident and optimistic eventually of a better future in a way that surrounding this core notion of community, right? Which Xers and boomers really don't share. And that's the critical, that's the fulcrum, right? That's the change right there coming out of the crisis. And then finally, you have this, what we call Homelander generation. People sometimes call them Gen Z, depending on how we want to define them. But they're the children of the crisis. And kind of my nomenclature, Homelanders are kids who cannot recall anything before the GFC, the global financial crisis. And in their entire lifetime, they are now, beginning to graduate high school now. The last wave of these kids the first wave of these kids is beginning to graduate high school. And the last wave probably won't be coming of age until the late 2020s, on my estimation. But the point is that these kids don't remember ever a time when the country wasn't in decline, We were constantly either coming into or trying to lift ourselves out of a recession when the weird, wild, and angry politics of populism and polarization were there in America. And their lesson is, dangerous things are happening in high places. Horrible things can happen to you overnight. You might be homeless. You might be shot on the streets. Stay quiet, obey the rules, and follow your parents. And meanwhile, these kids are being raised. The early wave of this generation is being raised almost entirely by Gen X. And Gen Xers, and this is a pattern we see again and again, are raising their own kids exactly the opposite of the way they've been raised. And again, this is an historical pattern, Ted. So Xers who had parents who left them completely alone. These were the home alone kids. You know what I mean? Just do whatever you want. You set up your own rules. The Xers are all over these Homelander kids, raising them very strictly with very careful rules. I talked to many of these kids who can't recall a single moment in their lives. They may be 16, 17 years old. They can't remember a single moment in their lives when a trusted adult did not know exactly where they were, right? Imagine that at that age. And you and I know there were plenty of moments when we were growing up when no one knew.
That's a fact. But I found it interesting in the book, and you might, as you move into the depth of this fourth turning, which we're in, I think, according to your book, and sort of the two ways you can go in here. But it was interesting to me that coming out of either one of those, whatever it was, that the Xers would lead the pack and sort of shift it over to millennials, and the Xers they've never been in that situation before until what you're talking about.
Well, the Xers in some ways are the ideal generation to be in midlife, and moving into midlife positions of authority and power. I'm talking about CEOs of corporations, admirals, generals. This year and next, the last boomers will be retiring from the military. The military is very age graded. You can just count the year,
Right.
They're moving out and the Xers are moving in. So increasingly we have an entirely Xer dominated military leadership. Even though in politics, Xers remain actually years away from, dominance in the Senate or the presidency, seemingly.
Yeah.
We don't know yet, but we'll have to see if there's any real good Xer contender. But the point is that Xers are pragmatic. They very focused on making things work again. They don't worry about what's perfect. They don't worry about taking us through a lot of trauma just because just because of some ethical or values concern. They're very bottom line. You could say even hardscrabble in wanting things to actually happen. And they have proven historically to be the ideal generation to actually make sure the country survives, right? Because they're very good at survival. Think about everything in the culture that's associated with survival with Xers. The very word survival in pop TV and social media has always been associated with Xers. And when survival really means something on a social scale, this will be the generation in charge in America. And I do talk about how we expect that generation to behave. And then coming after them, but not assuming top leadership age until after the crisis is over, moving into the next first turning, will be millennials, right? And millennials will make it all nice and shiny and it'll all look good. All the pieces now will begin to work flawlessly together again. And millennials, by the way, Ted, they will get their community. They will get their big national community. And all those Xers and boomers who are still alive watching it, they'll sort of shake their heads a little bit. They won't know what to make of this thing.
So you have, let me ask you on that question. So you have a two setup scenario sort of for in the next 10 years or so, but there's a catastrophic event in the fourth turnings that sort of brings people to their knees or together. And you have it's sort of, I can't remember the terminology, but you sort of have a positive outcome and a negative outcome. And you might, you throw it out there to say, hey, these are the things can happen in these two different times. There's different time, but we don't know, but this is what happens. That was really interesting to me.
Yeah, well, history shows that fourth turnings ultimately culminate in these moments of national urgency, right? When everyone realizes the very near term survival of their country is at stake. And this happened every time. This has always been associated with war. It's been associated with conflict, organized, large scale conflict. All of America's total wars have happened during fourth turnings. Every American fourth turning, Anglo-American fourth turning has had a total war, right? So now I don't insist that it requires a total war, but it does require that sense of urgency, and it requires that sense of organized conflict, galvanizing the country and mobilizing people to behave in civic ways and come together as a community that they would not ordinarily do. And people sometimes ask me, why are you so pessimistic? Why does it require a crisis like that? And I say, it's the only way that you actually motivate people to suddenly become a community again. The lesson is there again and again in history. And I take people through this, Ted. I mean, I don't know whether you want to call it getting scared straight. I mean, is that it? But you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah. And you make a point there, Neil, too, about how going back through the centuries, many times it was a war that really brought your country to its knees, and you had to pull together. But you make a point that what if it was a cyber attack, or they knock out the electric grid, the cyber attack? I mean, you'd be back to some tough times.
You'd be back to some tough times, and you always think about the impact of technology. During fourth turnings, one side or the other or both is always incentivized to use the maximal technology available at the time. I think you and I know, Ted, that if either Richmond or Washington D.C. had a weapon of mass destruction in 1863 or 64, they would have used it, right?
Yeah.
In fact, in the next fourth turning, we enlisted our best and brightest young people, many of whom even were card-carrying communists, it turned out. I mean, many of them, it didn't matter, because at that time, it didn't matter if you're communist or not. You all banded together to save America, right? And of course, he gave us the Manhattan Project. And they invented a weapon of mass destruction, which we promptly used. The only time we've used it. This fourth turning, we have 9 or 10 nations around the world that have weapons of mass destruction, right? And so it's a time of unique danger. There's no question about it. And we're not even talking about nukes. We're talking about other things. Some of the things you've talked about. Warrior nanobots and cyber attacks and so on. And it will be different, and it could spiral in very different directions. One thing I do talk a lot about is a question I get a lot. Will the conflict be external or internal? So I spend a lot of time on geopolitical conflict versus civil war. Mm-hmm. And one thing I do is I divide everyone thinks very dichotomous. You either have one or the other, right? And that's because we're all used to, World War II versus the Civil War, right? But one thing I point out in the book is that historically, there's more of a spectrum. You know what I mean? It's often both. The American Revolution, was that an external conflict? Well, the Patriots would like us to think so. We're throwing out Great Britain. But the Tories, and actually most Americans at the time in the 1780s, they didn't call it a revolution. They called it a civil war. It was Tories and Patriots in the United States killing each other. That's when most of the killing was done, not by redcoats. it was a huge civil war, particularly in the South, where you had this tremendous concentration of backwoods loyalists who were fighting the more, the more patriotic oriented planters, and wealthier planters on the coast. But we forget that the losing side of a civil war always calls in allies from abroad and turns it into an external war. I mean, the Patriots called in the French, right? Created an external conflict. The Confederates wanted to bring in the French and the English, and Lincoln barely got around that. World War II came right after the New Deal, which is one of the most internally divisive periods in American history in terms of the political divide between right and left. But one side called the 1930s the Red Decade, and the other side called the 1930s the Fascist Decade. I mean, you talk about a divided. Well, how did that finally culminate in World War II? That's where I'm going with this, Ted. There's a kind of a knife edge between external and internal, and you don't actually know,
right?
Even while you're in the fourth turning, how that's going to end up.
Yeah, and then because and so readers would like to know. I mean, just so we're not talking about apocalypse now, that you have a positive side too. You have you have two different scenarios there that, things that can happen in these periods. And sometimes it's interesting that you discuss the two. And so you show both sides.
I'm very positive about fourth turnings. I'm a long-term optimist about America. And I do think that the ability to respond and overcome these crises is what makes America stronger. And ultimately, I think the most pessimistic forecast of America right now, the thing that I think makes people more hopeless than anything else, is not a crisis. You know what it is, Ted? It's that all of the trends you see over the past 15 years will continue for the next 50, right?
Yeah.
Rich get richer, poor gets poorer. Its public institutions continue to deteriorate, less and less sense of any national cohesion. Where does that take you, right? If those trends continue to the year 2050, I don't know. Is it some dystopia, Blade Runner? I'm not sure where that is. But my point is that doesn't happen historically. You don't have a continuation. Things turn corner. I mean, that's the whole idea of it turning. The mood shifts. And these shifts can be very productive. I have a discussion in there about the saeculum, meaning the entire cycle of generational change as a complex social system. And complex social systems are often restorative. We know that throughout nature. A forest to thrive need periodic fires. Rivers to flow well need periodic floods. Nature is full of systems which require periodic kind of interruptions, in their kind of what we call punctuated equilibrium, where something happens and breaks and sort of redraws boundaries, and then things function better again. And this is not unusual in nature, and I think it's true in modern society as well, that we have moved into this kind of cyclical regime. And I will say as well that all of the great golden ages of history, certainly, we just look at American history, have occurred after a great crisis. People look back to the period of sort of civic unity and progress, not only productivity, but in terms of ultimately expansion and civil rights and so on that occurred in the late 40s, 1950s, and early 1960s. It's a period of tremendous advancement for everyone, majority, minorities, and a system in which people believed America was better than the sum of its parts, right? America was better than just the collective aggregate of all of us individuals. We actually together created something that exceeded any of us alone. I don't think any American feels like that today, by the way. I think most Americans today feel that the country as a whole is less than any of us individually, right? Any of us individually are wonderful. You go into a bookstore today, Ted, and all the happy and upbeat books are about me, myself, and I. I'm triumphant. I can do anything. But, the death of the family, death of government, death of politics, you see what I mean? But these periods are great golden ages, and they are only achieved in the aftermath of these breaks in history, these fourth turnings. So this is I see it in the sense of a restoration of an ever-changing equilibrium. It is what our society, it is where our society is now going, and ultimately it is a restorative in some sense. And I think this is how people are able to get a better sense of direction. I mean, we started out our discussion talking about people feel no sense of direction today. But things do resolve, and we move on to other issues.
There is a positive to it. And one of my last sort of wrap-up question for you, and I would tell everybody, if you will go through, this book is so interesting that we could never cover it in an interview, but you just have to read it. But my last question to you, this is a personal opinion of yours. How do you think on the investment world, when you're going into this next 9 or 10 years, how do you think people will be thinking about their money during that period? I mean, will there be shifts on how they'll pull in, or how do you think they will feel about it?
Wow, you left a big question right to the end here.
Yeah, well, I did, yes.
There's a lot of things to talk about here, and we could do another interview actually just on that. I would say, look, just looking at the record of history, nominally denominated investments are definitely a loser during fourth turnings. In other words, and I'm talking about all these fixed income, assets, because these are inflationary eras. They turn out to be inflationary eras, among other things. We see it even more today. How in the world are we going to get out from all this debt if we don't inflate our way out of at least some of it, right?
That's interesting, because you most of these fourth turnings ending up are inflationary.
Totally. Really? I mean, we had about as much debt at the end of World War II as we do now, right? And that was after the climax, right? After the Great Crisis. We had that moving into the climax, right? So imagine what we're going to have at the end of this. So now about half of that debt, about around 100% of GDP in 1946, we got out of through inflation. The other half through real economic growth, right? Until finally, by the late 1970s, we had a very low level of national debt to GDP, and of course that gave Reagan and Volcker a lot more opportunities than Congress faces today.
Now, that was a 25-year term to get. I have graphs of that too, like what you're talking about.
Exactly. So that's one thing, I think, and therefore I think also fourth turnings tend to be an era of deglobalization and commodity hoarding. Just think about World War II and think what the Japanese were after. Think what the Axis powers in Europe were after. And so these are good for some economies, the Australias and the Chiles of the world. I mean, you can go around and sort of think of them. And it also means that this deglobalization means that there will no longer be global prices in a lot of these things. So I think you have to think about anti-globalization as being a play. I mean, think about whether the value of your asset rests upon further globalization or a reversal of globalization. I think that you can buy a lot of assets. You can actually say, I'm betting on one or the other. I think it's clear which direction. By the way, we've been moving toward less trade in goods and services as a share of global product ever since 2008, ever since the GFC. So it started at the beginning of this fourth turning, and it will continue that way until the resolution of it. I think that a lot of disfavored sectors, uh, uh, not just commodities, but materials and manufacturing will do a lot better. Uh, Fourth turnings is when we're rebuilding the outer world. Remember, the awakening is when we turn to the inner world. Experiences became much more important. Transformation. What products meant to you was more important. Of course, boomers their whole lives have just been filled with that, right? They all want a custom made whatever.
Oh yeah.
They want the only house that was made in 1783. But in fourth turnings, we turn toward the outer world and the production of good enough for a great deal of people. I mean, think of what we did in the late 40s and 50s, for instance. We mass produced things that were good for a lot of people, and we also mass produced things to overcome other organizations, other powers. That was the genius that was unleashed during World War II. Levittown, Mr. Levitt, it was a Seabee during World War II. And they were in charge of like constructing these Quonset huts overnight in the South Pacific. He just took those same methods to Levittown and he started building the same mass production. But anyway, that's the move more that we're beginning to move toward. And I think you really want to think about those sectors more favorably, and some of the sectors, the high-end consumer goods and the what we today in the S&P called communications and so on, as less favorable. I think technology will always be a good play globally.
But you're saying commodities they're generally more favorable in the latter fourth turning.
Well, yeah, and they're favorable both because of the high inflation that we're going to see, and they're also be favorable because of this growing autarky around the world. The fact that you will have certain areas hoarding their commodities, right? And that's something we see repeatedly during fourth turnings. I think genuine diversification of assets is more important than ever today, as opposed to phony diversification. Remember that in crises, particularly market crises, all correlations go to one. That's the problem with diversification. Diversification on a sunny day is great, but when things go down, everything goes down. Well, in a fourth turning, what you see is that not everything goes down. If you're truly diversified in terms of assets and in terms of geography and so on, you actually can experience a fair degree of genuine diversification. But you need to expand your definition of diversification. I think it was Harry Markowitz. I can't remember, one of the great market theory guys, who said that the diversification is the only free lunch in economics, in portfolio theory. And yes, I agree with him. But in the fourth turning, it has to be outside the box diversification. And one last thought. This is something that often comes up, and I would say that people looking ahead for how to get through the fourth turning, I would just think about their lives. I often think the biggest thing you can do in thinking about things, because people always bring up, long-term care insurance and how I'm going to provide for myself, if certain things happen to me. And I often say the biggest preparation you can make in expectation of reduced public benefits, for instance, because the public sector may have more important things to do, you know what I mean, than your benefits. That we may be going through that kind of era. And I will tell people, mend relationships with your family. Ultimately, when you look at fourth turnings historically, you see that it's family relationships which become more important. During the unravelings, during the 1920s or during the 1990s, family seems ephemeral. We're all sort of independent free agents. We can all get our own income and we can all do our own thing. But during fourth turnings, we rely on each other a lot more. Pay attention to the relationship you have with your neighbors, and with your family, because ultimately that's what becomes really important when all the chips are down. And very often during a fourth turning, the chips are down, at least for brief periods of time.
Well, listen, Neil, we could go on for hours because there's so much in your book. And all along this interview, people would have seen where to get the book. But I know we talked about it, but you're on Amazon, Kindle. You even did your own audiobook. I mean, this book's great, and they can get it in many ways coming out today. I would recommend everybody to get it. This one was better than the other one, I have to tell you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, listen, we really thank you for taking the time to go through this with us, and we'll hope to see you back next year.
Dad, we'll do it. Maybe next time we'll talk a little bit more about the economy.
Well, all right. Listen, thanks a lot. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say, if you like this video and you want to see more of this type of information, because we really try to get the information that you don't see from anybody else, then be sure and click on subscribe, and you'll see more of what we do here at Oxbow.